Hello from Helensburgh, Wollongong, Australia. My name's Dr. Mark Fraser, and I work in the School of Education at the University of Wollongong. One of the areas that I work in is the postgraduate TESOL program, Teaching English to Speakers of Other Languages. And I'd like to thank you for allowing me to share a little bit of research that I've started and hopefully will turn into a longitudinal study coming out of these topsy-turvy times that we're living in. Things have changed quite a great deal in Wollongong. So I work in the postgraduate program for TESOL, and in normal times, we have a lovely mix of both domestic and international students. Our international students come from all over the world: China, Japan, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Mongolia, all throughout Europe, South America, so all around the world. And it's been brilliant to have them on campus. Now, one of the subjects that I teach or that I coordinate is the TESOL Professional Experience Program. And that's where both new and experienced teachers who take this subject are required to complete 30 hours of the placement, 10 hours observing classes, and then 20 hours of supervised teaching. The students are required to find their own placements. They can find them in any place that has students whose first language is not English and where they need English language support. So here in Australia, it could be the primary or elementary schools, the high schools, language centres. So our university has a language centre for international students who need to develop their English in preparation for entering university. There are many private English language centres that offer the similar service, and also vocational institutions that mainly cater to adult migrants who need to undertake English language courses to help them with employment and for general living. So that's in the normal times, normal days. But thanks to COVID, the pandemic times, our international arrivals have stopped. There are no students arriving, international students arriving. Similarly, there's no immigration because of a ban on international arrivals. So that's pretty much dried up opportunities in places like language centres at the university. It's changing the dynamics of the campus. So it's changing that learning experience. One time where we have these international students come in and we have a wonderful multicultural mix of people. Now that's all pretty much dried up. For our schools and our vocational institutions, the students are there. They're the ones that have been living here. They're not new arrivals. So we still have demand to cater to those students, but not as grand as before. So that means there are limited opportunities for professional experience in TESOL locally, which is really interesting because on the one hand, we have these restrictions causing these limitations. On the other hand, we're actually finding increasing enrolments from domestic students. Mostly teachers in practice, those who are currently teaching, are going back and doing a specialisation in EALD or teach English as an additional language or dialect, because there is actually an increasing demand for more specialised teaching, even though we're not getting the numbers in. Education management realising that students from a non-English speaking background who don't have high levels of English abilities still need specialised support. So we're getting quite a lot of enrolments through there. So what can we do if these places are drying up, the opportunities are limited? What can we do? And so the pandemic has in many ways restricted and caused a lot of challenges and heartache. However, like everything, there's a silver lining, and I believe that it's provided an opportunity in particular for professional learning of experienced teachers. And it's partly thanks to technology through the opportunities that have been presented through connecting via platforms like Zoom or Skype. So the aim of my research is to explore the value of an international remote professional placement experience for established teachers. I thought of what could I do for these students who are enrolling, and given that they're experienced teachers, they don't need to learn about how to be a teacher. They need some experience about how to be a teacher that teaches English to non-English speaking students. And so I dipped into my networks of UOW alumni, and so lucky that I was able to connect with a few of the alumni who are going to help out. So the way that I'm approaching this research is from a professional learning perspective, through the lens of professional learning, because for established teachers, they're not undertaking this course to start a career in teaching. They've been, for many of them, they've been teaching for many, many years, not so much teaching English, but teaching in the mainstream. So they're not early career teachers where a professional learning or a placement is generally focused on that transition process, going from being pre-service and into early career. They're more interested in upskilling, even developing a new skill that they can add to their repertoire of teaching. And so the way that I'm looking at it is as a professional learning, but the research around generally is focused on either pre-service or early career teachers. There doesn't seem to be too much on established teachers doing professional placements as such. We have quite a fair bit on professional development, looking at workshops and so forth, but not so much this professional learning. And in fact, the way that I want to look at professional learning is not so much in terms of a structured learning experience like coursework, because this professional learning, even though there's a structure, there's some requirements, in a way, the learning that I'm looking at is that kind of incidental learning or informal learning that goes along with it. There's no expectation for our students to learn anything in particular, apart from just experiencing teaching English as another language. So in a way, there's a bit of a blur in this professional learning into the informal aspect of it. We just don't know what they're going to get out of it, given their backgrounds and their experiences. So I also draw on some of the literature to do with informal learning, and EROUT is one of the main go-tos when we're looking at informal learning in the workplace. So informal learning is a great way to look at how we develop as an individual, how we make meaning of certain events that contribute to our development. It's a way that we reconceptualize some of our ideas, our beliefs, and our practices. So this is kind of the lens that I'm looking at this research through. So we know that teaching practice is influenced through our own perceptions and our own personal identity, the things that we bring to the teaching role. And the same with professional learning. We look at what's in it for me. But the trouble with a lot of professional learning, professional development, it's kind of a one size fits all. And it generally has a limited effect, kind of a sugar hit. We all go to workshops and seminars and conferences, and we get good ideas. In many ways, sometimes it's confirmation of what we're doing, especially for teachers. There's no real transformation going on as an outcome of engagement with these professional learning. And in actual fact, many teachers shy away from professional learning They're obliged to do it, so they do it, but they find them as irritating add-ons to their normal teaching obligations. And so for professional learning to be effective, it needs to be intensive, ongoing, and connected to practice. And so this professional experience that I coordinate is very much about that, is making connection to practice. But a very large part of the program is the students are required to engage in critical reflection, to really explore the meaning of these experiences for their own transformation or regeneration of their teacher identity. So just a little bit about the context of this study. The institution in particular, the one that's the focus of this study, is in Indonesia, close to Medan. It's a technology institute that was established in about 2005 that caters for students from low socioeconomic backgrounds. And so again, in normal times, the students would attend campus. Undergraduates, and most of them are studying engineering. But because of the pandemic, a great percentage of the students have returned home and they're doing remote learning. There are some students who've remained on campus for various reasons, but many of them have returned home. And as you can see, Indonesia is spread out, comprised of many, many islands. And so a great range of learning styles, backgrounds, situations. So it's a very challenging time at the moment to try to deliver a program. And in this case, it's an English language program for undergraduate engineers or students studying engineering. And it's a English language program that focuses mostly on grammar and building vocabulary. In some ways, you could say it's kind of that traditional EFL English language teaching context. The Australian context, where my student or the UOW student is coming from, is from the Catholic diocese. So in Australia, the main provider of education at primary and secondary level is are the governments, the state governments, and then the second is the Catholic system, the Catholic Church. And so the UOW student in this study works in the Catholic diocese in Sydney, where the curriculum is mainstream curriculum. So we're talking about the mainstream here. It's designed around the learner. The learner is kind of centered to the curriculum. It's about exploring. It takes a sociocultural approach to learning through social interactions. And so quite a contrast to the learning of English, apart from the different levels of education, but you can already see there's quite a distinction between the two pedagogies and the educational contexts. So my bright idea was to get my student here to teach remotely into the classroom in Indonesia. And in a way, this is like doing an international placement. And the literature has a lot of discussions about the benefits of international placements, that it enhances the professional and personal identities, develops cultural competency, improves pedagogical practices, applies the theoretical principles and concepts. So students leave their teacher education courses and go on a short-term placement in another country, and they get that opportunity to apply the theory and the content from their courses. It's also, the value there is to challenge assumptions and beliefs. You know, we live in a bit of a bubble, so to speak. We're getting out of our comfort zone, taking with us all these assumptions, our values, our beliefs, and looking at life and the world from a different perspective. And so being challenged on those. But again, many of those, the literature around international placements is focused on students that are in the undergraduate program, pre-service, sometimes in service early career, but not many on established teachers. and they're on site, so meaning that they physically leave one country to go to the other. But what about established teachers? Established teachers in their careers? Well, hopefully this is what the study is about. Let's have a look at, because of pandemic, obviously we can't leave the country. So what do we do? Can we still have this kind of international experience? Well, that's what this study is about. And my theoretical framework for this is symbolic interactionism. It's a bit of I guess it's a lost art. The focus in many research contexts in education is taking on a sociocultural perspective, but I like symbolic interactionism. And I think it's a very useful framework to use when we're looking at complex cultural situations where we're not trying to be absolute about something. And in this study, I'm really interested in the interpretations of the interactions of the participants. Symbolic interactionism focuses on how individuals make meaning through their interactions with objects, and the objects can be defined as physical, social, and abstract. So I'm interested in how the participants in this study interpret their interactions with these objects, given that they're not together, they're teaching remotely. Is there any value in doing a placement remotely? And so just a bit about the research outline. It was a very simple study, but one that produced quite rich data. I conducted semi-structured interviews with the two participants, Maggie and Aulia. Maggie is the Australian and Aulia is the supervising teacher in Indonesia. And so I conducted 2 semi-structured interviews. In addition to that, I also did a bit of a content analysis of Maggie's assessment tasks. So in the placement, students are required to complete the 30 hours. They're also required to complete 3 assessment tasks based around their experience. The first assessment task is a report just describing the teaching context they're going to be teaching in, and their thoughts, their assumptions about that teaching and how they're going to go in that teaching. The second assessment task is on observations. They're the observations that they're required to do. And the third assessment task is a critical reflection on their whole teaching experience, where they reflect on their teaching, the supervising teacher reports, and feedback. So I used Maggie's assessment task to supplement the semi-structured interviews. This research is more interested in any changes that take place from Maggie's perspective, obviously because she's the one who's doing an experience, and you know, it's hoped that that's where the transformation takes place. But I'm also interested in Aulia's experience as well. Even though she's the supervising teacher, what could Aulia learn from Maggie, given that Maggie is a practicing teacher here in Australia? So I analysed the data, looking for emergent themes and patterns and the objects that they found meaningful. So the themes contributed to identifying these objects that were significant for them through their social interactions and that process of them becoming a teacher. So let me just tell you a little bit about Maggie. Maggie's worked, as I said, in the Catholic system for over 25 years. She's taught as a mainstream teacher, as well as an inclusive teaching, so special needs. And she's just starting to teach students from non-English speaking backgrounds. She's also in a leadership role where she's responsible for developing literacy practices for teachers in her diocese. So here is somebody who's very well experienced in teaching, but also very knowledgeable about literacy. And literacy in Australia at the moment is getting a lot of attention. There's a lot of programs around. There's a lot of focus on developing students' literacy abilities. So Maggie's job is to develop those literacy abilities, the teaching strategies in her teachers. She's located in Western Sydney, where the curriculum is designed for a monolingual society, English-speaking society. However, in her diocese, around about 70% of the students come from non-English speaking backgrounds, and that ranges from those who don't need language support to those who do need language support. But EALD in the diocese has been neglected over the years, and so that's why Maggie's undertaking the postgraduate in the TESOL, because she felt ill prepared. So first, here we see Maggie taking the initiative to upskill. She wants to extend herself to get a deeper understanding about how to support these learners. And that's not always the case in education in Australia. Aulia is, as I said, is the supervising teacher at the Technology Institute in Indonesia. She's a UOW alumni. She studied the Masters of Education in TESOL. She was actually one of my students about 5 or 6 years ago. She's also in a leadership role at the Institute, where she teaches English to undergraduate engineers. This is the first time that she's actually undertaken a supervising role. Even though she's in a leadership position, she's helped new teachers start at the Institute, given the initiation into the Institute, but she's never really undertaken a supervisory role. So I'm really interested to see the knowledge exchange between the two. What did Maggie learn, obviously, but also what did Aulia learn as well? So the key findings for the study, let's have a look at Maggie. And what did I find from the interviews and from the data from Maggie about the value of this placement, this remote placement that is has many challenges, because obviously it's being remote, but there's also the added challenge of technology and others. So, so the overarching research question is what value is there in doing this remote placement? So from Maggie, one of the things that struck me was that she never realized many things. This placement made her realize things that she took for granted. So for example, she took for granted how comfortable she was in her teaching in the diocese. So this comment here, I've been teaching kids with English background. I've never taught English as a foreign language. So that's only natural, that's her job and that's the context she's teaching in. But she's never really considered what if I had a student in my class who needed language support, whose first language is not English. What would I do? What are my strategies? So even though she's well experienced and she's her area is literacy, from this experience, she began to question, I never really thought about that. I'm really in my comfort zone. She also found the technology brought her out of her comfort zone as well. So the Zoom was challenging. I think that challenged a lot of us at the start of the pandemic. And so not only the technology, but also applying, working with that technology to try to create an engaging classroom. So here we have a primary school teacher whose teaching context is very much face-to-face and engagement and interaction, very deep and close interactions with her students, suddenly put in this situation where she's remote, even though the students' faces are only about a foot away from her on the screen. There's still this remoteness and the challenges of using the Zoom. So the technology kind of pushed her out of her comfort zone and made her rethink her teaching strategies and rethink the way to deliver content, reconceptualize. One of the big kind of takeaways for Maggie was that she had to relearn the rules of grammar. And this has had implications for her teaching and for advising. She made the comment that all those grammar structures are innate, I guess, with any native speaker, the grammar structures are innate. From when we first start learning to communicate in our first language, we start to get this inbuilt understanding about the grammar structures we just grew up with. And so we didn't need to know. And again, through this experience, it made her realize that she didn't know a lot about the grammar and about the rules of English. And it stumped her because it made her realize we should know more. In our teaching roles, we should know more so we can explain it to those students, not just students whose first language is not English, but also those students who have low levels of literacy. Because English is our first language, she realized that she was working on, does that sound good? Or does that sound like a good sentence? Something that we draw on as native speakers. But for EALD learners or for EFL learners, they don't have that innateness. So she had to be more explicit about her teaching and about her explanation. And she found herself going back to the books and learning and being stumped in front of the class because she couldn't answer questions. And she felt quite embarrassed about it, quite exposed. And through that process, she had her beliefs challenged. When she first started the experience, she was this diehard socioculturalist. She was into functional grammar and learning through social interaction and learning language through context. But having taught English at the Institute, where the focus was more on grammar and on vocabulary, she realized the purpose was very different to that of teaching in Australia. The purpose mainly at the Institute was to develop the students' language abilities in many ways to prepare them for the tests that they were going to face. And so this really challenged her notion, not just of teaching English, but also teaching in general and the purpose of education. And at the start, she felt really uncomfortable. Then she realized it was okay. It was okay that there's a different perspective to teaching English. And there's a different way of teaching English. So this had implications for her teaching back here in Australia, because it meant that she could see teaching in a different light. But more importantly, it meant that if she was to receive new arrivals who had some English education overseas, she now has an understanding about what type of education that they have experienced. She now realizes that even though they may have spent 5 or 10 years learning English in their home country, the type of English they were learning was very different. And in that way, she can use that knowledge to better plan and support English language learners in her class back here in Australia. And overall, she found the whole experience was rewarding and felt very lucky that she got to do it. And this was a really important point because it meant in their busy lives, teachers here in Australia and like teachers anywhere in the world, they rarely get this opportunity to enter into the reflective space, to really explore their own identity as teachers and their teaching practices, to question their teaching practices. So what this placement did for Maggie was that it made her stop and reflect on those practices she was quite comfortable with. She was in a bit of a bubble. She never really questioned. After doing this experience, she realized that she now has a whole different perspective and she feels so lucky. And she's now going to encourage other teachers to do the same experience because she feels that it really regenerates her teaching practice and regenerates her teaching identity. For Alia, there were also some realizations, not as grand as Maggie's. And one thing that I was interested in was looking at whether, because Maggie was well experienced, whether any of Maggie's teaching experience rubbed off onto or impacted on Alia. given that English is Aulia's second or other language, whether there was any changes in her English abilities. One of the first things that Aulia commented on was that was the wonderful opportunity that this provided for her, the opportunity to supervise a teacher from another country. This is a rare opportunity that has never happened before. And because of COVID, this opportunity came up. So she grabbed it with both hands. And actually, Maggie was her second student. She did have a student from UOW just before Maggie. And it was interesting to see her expectations. And here we can see kind of the challenge in a way of the native dominance in the psyche of EFL teachers. Aulia, when she first accepted the first student from UOW, she had high expectations because he was an Australian, a native speaker, and so should be brilliant at being an English teacher, and this is going to be so exciting. However, because the student had never taught before, her expectations were kind of brought down a little bit, and again challenged in a little way Aulia's notion of nativeness and that kind of ownership, which was kind of interesting. When Maggie came along, it was the opposite. Because of the first student, Aulia didn't really expect a lot from Maggie. She just thought, well, we'll see how we go with this one. But from the start, she realized that Maggie was very different, that Maggie came prepared, asked lots of questions, and generally there was this kind of feeling of experience and experienced teachers. So those expectations rose again. And because of that, Aulia was fortunate enough to observe Maggie teaching, obviously through the supervision, and realize a few things. And one thing that Aulia realized was the way that Maggie handled classroom management and the rapport with the students. Not to say that Aulia didn't have a good rapport with the students or didn't have good classroom management, but because of teaching over Zoom, Aulia indicated that she felt a bit pressured to get the work done, to cover the coursework, and so didn't really give much consideration about engagement through the Zoom. She tried a few things, she had done some professional learning, but really didn't spend a lot of time on thinking about how to engage the students. Where Maggie, that was front and center. From the start, Maggie wanted to learn all of the students' names so that she could build that rapport, could build that relationship. She asked all the students to keep their cameras on during the class. This is something that Maggie seemed to shy away from. If the students didn't turn their camera on, she thought it was okay, but she felt it was amazing how Maggie handled or managed the class in a nice way, not in a confronting way. And so one of the takeaways for Aulia was that she learned a bit more about classroom management, something that was compatible for that teaching context, not something that was unique to Australia, but what wouldn't really work in Indonesia. But she could see the compatibility of what Maggie was doing in her classroom, and she was going to try it for her, and she could see that it could work there. I asked Aulia about her English proficiency and whether she noticed any changes, and she said it was okay. There wasn't any significant change, which was really interesting given that she was very excited about having a native speaker, working with a native speaker. I had an assumption that she would have liked to have learnt more about English or brush up on English or fine tune her English, but there was no discussion about that. The focus was purely on the teaching. And this was a wonderful thing about this engagement. It went past that kind of just the focusing on the language and looking more at the professional aspect, the teaching aspect. And that was a really interesting finding from the study. So what does all this mean? Well, there's a few takeaways from this study that's beginning to show, and of course, need to do a little bit more. But what I did find was that the way that both Maggie and Aulia talked about their experiences, that indicated a rich and complex process of interpreting their interactions. Getting back to the symbolic interaction objects, the physical, the technology, the lack of the physical space, so working from the home and trying to create an engaging classroom over the internet, really played with their psyche and with their beliefs and values as teachers. Social was a very big part of it. And it was a case of renegotiation of roles as a leader. For Maggie, it was about a leader becoming a student. For Aulia, it was about a teacher becoming a leader and a mentor. The complexity of the rapport between the students and Maggie. When Maggie first started teaching the students were very reluctant to engage with her because they were worried about their levels of English, and so were very shy to share. And one thing that Maggie found that was quite effective was, instead of asking the students to turn on their microphones and talk if they had a question, is to write that question in the chat. And so they were more comfortable writing their questions in the chat than they were of using their microphone. So that gives an indication that the students were engaging and that they were keen to learn. It's just that they weren't at that comfort level yet. By the end of the experience, that comfort level had risen and they were more willing to be more vocal in the classroom. And then there's the abstract objects, the challenging of the beliefs and the realigning of perceptions of cultural values. Maggie found out a lot more detail about Indonesian culture and society through her students, through interactions. She picked up some language, some cultural aspects that she never knew of, and not just specific to Indonesia, but the broader concepts now give her a deeper understanding of culture that she can apply back here in Australia. It also challenged her notions of education, of teaching and learning, and that whole knowledge exchange between the knowledge that Aulia had about teaching and learning and education, and and Maggie's reciprocating. What this study also does, it contributes to the internationalisation of higher education. I think this is where we're going. I think this is beginning the start of the new norm, is that do we really need to leave the country to have that international experience? Well, of course, we'd love to leave the country. I'd love to be on site delivering this lecture rather than through the video. But the pandemic has shown us that despite these limitations, there are still opportunities for a deep and meaningful learning experience to happen. And I think this creates a nice network, a nice alternative that we can explore. When we think about it, Maggie went into a part of Indonesia that she probably would never have gone into in her whole life. She has gone into a classroom where students, for many students, this was the first time that they'd ever encountered a native speaker. The teachers that they have in that part of Indonesia were Indonesians. And so because of this pandemic, because of the technology, Maggie was able to go into those classrooms and they were able to experience a novelty or a different approach to learning. And so I think this internationalization aspect of it is quite an interesting area to explore. The knowledge exchange that can come from this, the sharing of knowledge about pedagogy, about education, about language, about culture, all contributes to that professional learning. And that's where that informalness comes in, is that it wasn't planned, that there were many, it was multi-pronged. and very complex, and the after effect is going to go on for some time for Maggie and for Aulia. And as I said, it gave that opportunity for teachers to enter the reflective space, which is a major contributor to this learning experience. Critical reflection is a big thing, and you can see on the screen there this little diagram that I use to give a simplistic overview of the structure of a critical reflection. A way that we can describe a critical reflection is by connecting experience to some kind of theoretical principle, to explore that experience through the lens of theory, through sociocultural, through grammar translation, whatever. And then within the expectations of what we're expected to do as teachers and by society. So the reflective space, I think, is a very important aspect of this experience. And so just to conclude, that COVID may have restricted travel, but it hasn't restricted these opportunities to continue professional learning. The technology has afforded individuals to be immersed in these contexts. And so I guess that's the real key here, is that advancement of technology, the ability to connect to these remote areas. It's not just remote learning, it's remote areas that we're going into, opening up opportunities that wouldn't be there before, to provide these different perspectives and these different approaches to learning and teaching. It's about local talent being valued. So it wasn't a case of importing foreign teachers to teach English. There were local teachers there controlling and developing and taking ownership of that language learning process. But here we had somebody coming into, in a way, being a guest speaker in that context, coming in not dominating, but coming in at the request of the local talent. And I think that's a really important point too, not just for teaching, but also if we're looking at educational experiences like entering into a master's program, is valuing the local talent. English language teaching has evolved so much that there's so many qualified English language teachers in places like Indonesia that there's going to come a time where we don't need native teachers to teach those fundamentals of English. We should be moving on and looking at something a bit more specialized. And that's what this professional experience has provided. And on that note, I'd like to say thank you very much for enduring my presentation. I hope you found it valuable, and all the very best. Thank you.